Welcome back to my video series, What's So Great About Evolution, Part 2 of 3. If you haven't seen Part 1, it might be a good idea to check it out first, and then come back to Part 2.
Let's start with the basics. If you remember what you learned in high school biology, all living things can be organized into different groups and subgroups called kingdoms, phylums, classes, orders, families, genuses, and species, simply based on their physical similarities and differences. Here is a simple diagram showing how the 30 major groups are arranged with lines that connect similar groups by common anatomy. Any creature alive today can be organized into a group, within a larger group, within an even larger group, etc. And the members of a particular group only share features with other members of the group. For instance, all birds have feathers. Mammals, over here in this group, don't have any feathers, and neither do reptiles over here. But birds and reptiles are both part of a larger group of animals that have similar skull openings and lay eggs. Mammals, however, don't lay eggs, but instead gestate with placentas and give birth to live young, which makes them part of a separate group. But mammals and reptiles are all part of a larger group called amniotes, because we all share the same basic egg structure. If you keep going down the family tree, you'll see that mammals, reptiles, and birds are all part of the same larger group as fish and amphibians, because we all share the same basic central nervous system and spinal cord, which makes us vertebrates. And the internal organs that all vertebrates share with insects, crustaceans, and mollusks makes us all part of the animal kingdom.
Now, most people really don't think about this, but there isn't any good reason, except for the theory of evolution by common descent, to explain why every living thing can be organized this way. The special creation of all living things in their current form shouldn't produce this kind of distinct organization, unless it was done intentionally. In fact, we don't see this kind of organization in other things that are created individually.
Take automobiles, for instance. They are not related to one another, so each one can be designed and built independently without these constraints of common ancestry. Unlike living things, automobiles can mix and match features and don't fall into a hierarchical pattern of groups within groups within groups. For instance, you can get a truck with either 2 or 4 doors. You can get a station wagon or a sports car with 4-wheel drive. You can get an SUV or minivan with power doors, and any vehicle can come in practically any color. But when it comes to the so-called diversity of life on our planet, everything seems to be constrained by tightly nested groups within larger groups. We don't find mammals with feathers, or reptiles with hair, horses with wings, or amphibians that give birth to live young. Now, if all living things were created as separate and distinct species in their current form, like automobiles, for instance, why does everything appear to be related in this big family tree?
Now, as a scientific theory, the special creation model can't explain any of this. The only conclusion is that God must have just made the species like this. And while this might be theologically satisfying, it doesn't have any scientific merit, since God could have easily made the species like automobiles if he wanted to. In fact, God could have given us clear and unmistakable proof of special creation by doing it this way. But as it turns out, the distinct hierarchical pattern of nested groups fits perfectly into the evolutionary creation model.
Now, the pattern of biological groups within groups could just be a coincidence. This by itself doesn't really prove that evolution is correct, but we can use this diagram to start making some very testable predictions. For instance, if this model of evolution is correct, then the Earth would have once been teeming with creatures that became extinct along the way. In fact, we should be able to find some of these things in the fossil record if we know where to look, and we should never find a population of species that lived before their supposed ancestors. We might not find everything on this diagram, but even just a few examples would demonstrate the usefulness of evolutionary science to make testable predictions. And if we don't find these fossils, or if we do find fossils but they don't fit into this pattern here, then evolution will end up in the dustbin of history alongside other bad ideas like geocentrism or the flat Earth.
Now, in fairness, the special creation model can also make some testable predictions. For instance, if all creatures were created only a few thousand years ago in their current form, then we shouldn't find fossilized remains of anything that isn't already alive on the Earth today. And all species alive today should clearly appear in the fossil record all at the same time and remain relatively unchanged up through the geological column. Things can become extinct like the dinosaurs, but nothing new should appear. So what do we actually find?
Well, as it turns out, we find nothing but bacteria and algae in layers of Earth older than 700 million years. And after about 550 million years, we find some skeletal remains of extinct multicellular animals, but nothing that resembles anything we know of today. Then we see some weird jawless fish about 500 million years ago, followed by more familiar fish with jaws. The first amphibians don't appear until about 350 million years ago, and they look more like fish than modern amphibians do. The first reptiles don't appear until about 280 million years ago, and they look more like amphibians than modern reptiles do. Then came the dinosaurs shortly after that, then small mammals and birds, then the extinction of dinosaurs about 65 million years ago, which paved the way for larger mammals, and finally humans about 200,000 years ago. So what does all of this mean? Well, according to the evolutionary model of creation, the fossil record looks just like it should. We've even found some of the more challenging transitional species, like the links between land mammals and marine mammals, and between reptiles and birds. In fact, whenever a new transitional species is discovered, it fits perfectly into the existing pattern, and is always right where it should be in the geological column, just as we should expect if evolution were true.
Now, how are you supposed to explain this in terms of the special creation model? Well, you really can't. The evidence just doesn't fit. Now, all of this could just be a weird coincidence, or it could be attributed to some unknown phenomenon that scientists have yet to discover. But there is one test that none of the first evolutionary scientists, not even Charles Darwin himself, could have possibly imagined: the genetic test.
During the first 100 years of evolutionary science, the actual mechanism of biological heredity was unknown. It wasn't until the 1940s that the genetic code, written in the language of DNA, was discovered. Since DNA is always passed from ancestors to descendants, it preserves a detailed record of who is related to whom.
In many ways, this was the perfect test for the theory of evolution, because if DNA testing of the 30 major biological groups revealed relationships between the species other than those determined by comparative anatomy or the fossil record, then evolution was in big trouble. Or, if DNA testing of the 30 major groups revealed no relationships at all between the species, then this would strongly favor the special creation model. And the idea of evolution would be finished once and for all. Just think, no more legal battles over what version of science should be taught in school. Evolution would disappear purely on scientific grounds, and atheists everywhere would have to find some other excuse not to believe in God. But what did DNA testing of the species actually reveal?
The relationships between the species, originally derived from comparative anatomy, were overwhelmingly confirmed by molecular genetics. Now, just in case there is any confusion over what I mean by overwhelming, let me put this into perspective. There are 100 billion different ways that one could organize the 30 major biological groups into nested subgroups, but it takes a very specific arrangement to confirm the theory of evolution. To construct an arrangement based solely on genetic similarities and differences, several different genetic markers had to be traced between the species to organize these same 30 groups into subgroups, and these organizations were compared against a traditional organization based solely on anatomy. So what was the result? Well, it is well known in science that one can never know anything with absolute certainty, but if something can be measured to an accuracy of 3 or 4 decimal places, like the universal gravitational constant for instance, then it is usually accepted as a scientific fact. So how well can we measure evolution? Well, the statistical correlation between the various hierarchical patterns of biological groups can be measured to within 38 decimal places. For all practical purposes, this constitutes an exact match, a match that should only exist if the theory of common descent is true, and we can measure this with more certainty than we can measure anything else in nature.
Now, how are we supposed to understand this data in terms of the special creation model? If we hold fast to the belief that the species were created separately, then we must also believe that God created them to appear related. And since this charade extends to both anatomy and the fossil record, we must also conclude that this deception was intentional. But why? For what purpose? Is this a test of our faith? A test of our trust in the Bible, perhaps? Or is it possible that we are reading too much into the Genesis creation account? For more on how science relates to the Bible, I would invite you to watch my video series entitled Does Science Contradict the Bible? On my website, or you can get my book on Amazon.com. Now, what about all of that so-called evidence against evolution, like those things touted by the creation science and intelligent design movements? If the evidence for common descent is so overwhelming, then why do so many still claim that this model is flawed? I hope you'll join me in part 3 as we look more closely at this.